Kog'Maw and other scaling ADCs are absolutely thriving right now. Early game items like Serrated Dirk and Collector get nerfed more and more, which means late game hypercarries have it much easier these days to reach their late game power spikes. In the beginning of the season, bot lane was all about burst damage with a lethality rework. Especially Serrated Dirk started out super oppressive, and with champions like MissFortune terrorizing the early game, Kog'Maw got mercilessly pushed out of the meta. However, as you know, many things changed since then, and in today's bot lane environment, the marksmen at the top of the food chain are late game hypercarries. And Kog'Maw stands out here especially because unlike his fellow late game monsters like Jinx or Twitch, he fully commits to on-hit items, which are among the strongest items in the game right now. There is nothing scarier than seeing Kog'Maw plus Enchanter on the enemy team when you enter Champ Select, especially since more aggressive support items such as Realm Spike or Bloodsong got nerfed, making Enchanters stronger by comparison. Strong Enchanters equals strong Kog'Maw because they easily patch Kog'Maw's only weakness, his lack of mobility and defensive spells. But the flexibility of on-hit builds in combination with the support from strong enchanters like Janna or Lulu just create a perfect environment for the champion, and in this video I will tell you everything you need to know about Kog'Maw's rune and item choices, as well as his in-game strategy so you can win more games with Kog'Maw yourself. However, please don't make the mistake of thinking that an enchanter would be 100% mandatory for Kog'Maw to function, because that's just not true. As you will see during the analysis part of the video, Kog'Maw can also be played with non-enchanter support champions. And this is important, because if you are grinding solo queue with Kog'Maw in order to climb, you cannot rely on your random support player to always pick an enchanter for you. Solo queue boils down to consistency, and if your champion only worked in specific team compositions, it would just not be a good pick. However, Kog'Maw is the best solo queue AD carry in the game right now, but you have to keep some things in mind when your support doesn't come with perfect synergy. In general, there are lots of things to keep in mind when you want to improve your solo queue rank, and an educational video like this one can only tell you so much. Everyone learns at different rates, and every solo queue player has their unique struggles they need to overcome in order to improve and climb. But this is where my sponsor Solo Queue Solution is a literal game changer for you. Solo Queue Solution is a League of Legends coaching company, and they will connect you with a challenger coach who works with you in individualized one-on-one coaching sessions. The perfect environment to identify and work on whatever it is that hinders your growth in your unique solo queue journey. With their vast knowledge and experience, the coach can tell you exactly what you have to do and how you have to practice in order to improve, and with their expertise, the coaches from Solo Queue Solution have helped countless average silver players to rank in Diamond Elo consistently. Of course, the coach can only help you to improve your rank if you play enough solo queue to actually implement what you learn, but if you play at least 15 hours of ranked per week, you are a perfect fit for the Coaching to Diamond program. If you're interested, you can book your first session right away following the link in the description, and now the advertisement is over. So let's first talk about Kog'Maw's optimal rune and item choices, so you can copy those right away. The best Kog'Maw rune page is Lethal Tempo, Triumph, Legend Alacrity, and Last Stand, with Conditioning and Overgrowth secondary. Lethal Tempo should be self-explanatory. Kog'Maw is a late-game hypercarry, and Lethal Tempo is the keystone for late-game hypercarry champions. The ramping attack speed scales with the damage effects from your items, and the extra range make it harder for the enemy to punish you. And on Kog'Maw in particular, this rune is nothing short of amazing because of his W. Your W damage by itself will carry fights if you have enough attack speed, so it's just the most important stat for the champion. In the next slot, most Kog'Maw players pick Triumph, and the reason is that Kog'Maw's biggest weakness is that he's a sitting duck. If the enemy manages to gap close through lethal tempos and your W's bonus range, you will take a lot of damage because you have no way to escape. As a result, the extra healing from Triumph can come in clutch during late-game teamfights, but also during early-game skirmishes it is nothing to scoff at. In the next slot, however, the choice is a little more interesting. Legend Alacrity is the preferred option in most cases because it just patches your early game, which is Kog'Maw's weakest point. And as I've said, attack speed is the most important stat on the champion, so at all stages of the game Legend Alacrity will put in lots of work. However, especially in games where you don't buy Blade of the Ruined King, Legend Bloodline is a noteworthy alternative. It does scale much better than Legend Alacrity, also with the extra bonus health it gives you, and the lifesteal of course makes up for the absence of Blade of the Ruined King. Realistically though, you will get Blade of the Ruined King in most games, and in these games Legend Alacrity is just a little better in my opinion. Ultimately, the choice is up to you, of course. Okay, in the last slot you, interestingly enough, pick Last Stand. Most champions would pick Coup de Grace, and especially champions who want to scale into the late game also have the option to pick Cut Down. For Kog'Maw, however, Last Stand is the best pick, and here's why. As I've already mentioned, and as you probably also know from your own experience, Kog'Maw gets targeted very heavily. Despite your long range, you will take a lot of damage back, and to counter this, you will also stack a lot of HP, as you can already see from your secondary runes. As a result, Last Stand increases your damage more than any of the other 2 runes ever could. But speaking of the secondary runes, Conditioning and Overgrowth are optimal on Kog'Maw because, as I've mentioned, most of your damage comes from your W in combination with attack speed. Crit marksmen like Jinx really like the extra AD from Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm, but Conditioning and Overgrowth are much better on Kog'Maw. But of course you have to keep in mind that these runes only kick into gear in the late game, so during the early game you need to be extra careful. Yet in the late game especially, a lot of burst damage will fly around, and you have to survive the initial burst from whoever enemy decides to jump on you in order to do anything meaningful. Alright, with that being said, let's talk about the item build. Kog'Maw always starts with Doran's Blade and rushes Berserker's Greaves. You need as much early game safety as possible, so a greedy start like Kal would always be a mistake on this champion. And while Berserker's Greaves are primarily a defensive purchase, allowing you to run away if the enemy tries to gank you, they also provide Kog'Maw with a lot of offensive firepower. As you will see during the analysis part, just the Berserker's Greaves power spike is already quite massive for this champion. After Berserker's Greaves though, you continue with your offensive core items, and for the most part these are Blade of the Ruined King, Rage Blade and Runan's Hurricane. Not only do these items come with their very own on-hit effects, increasing your damage, but the attack speed of course also makes it easier to stack Lethal Tempo for even more attack speed, and to apply your W as often as possible. As we can see, there's not a single % penetration item in there, such as Lord Dom's, or Mortal Reminder, or Terminus. The only one of these that would make sense is Terminus, by the way, because Kog'Maw deals mixed damage, but the fact you deal mixed damage also makes a % penetration item less important in general. It is very hard to itemize defensively against a Kog'Maw, therefore these items are generally speaking all the damage you need, whereas other AD carries need a Last Whisper item. And this is the beauty of unhit builds. You actually don't need a full build, unlike a crit marksman, to come fully live. The damage from just these 3 items and W is all you need, so you have tons of flexibility for the rest of your item build. Yes, there are late game offensive options, namely Kraken Slayer and Phantom Dancer, but I highly recommend not buying these. They are mostly a trap for beginners. It makes sense at first sight, because especially when you're new to AD carry, you might think all you need to do is deal damage. While this is true of course, you don't deal damage when you're dead, and you also don't need to overkill your enemy. When you have enough damage to out DPS anyone in the fight, you don't need more, it's just a waste of gold at this point. Instead, I highly recommend you get defensive items late game. The most important one is Jackshaw the Protean, because it gives both armor and magic resist, as well as extra health. It has the best defensive profile no matter which of the 5 enemy champions tries to jump on you. In addition to Jackshaw the Protean, you can then either get Randuin's Omen in case the enemy physical damage dealers are more important, or you can get Kaenic Rukon in case the enemy magic damage dealers are the bigger threat. However, there are also late game options that combine offense and defense, namely Terminus, Wit's End, Shield Bow and Guardian Angel. All of these items will increase your damage at least by a little bit, or sometimes even by a lot in case of Terminus or Wit's End, but they crucially also provide some defensive stats. All of these items have their place, Shield Bow for example when you skipped Blade of the Ruined King, Guardian Angel when you really need that revive passive, Wit's End against crowd control, and Terminus should the enemy stack resistances. But in most games I recommend the purely defensive options, because your 3 item core of on-hit items is most of the time just enough. And with that being said, let's jump into the analysis to see what that looks like in practice. When you are lucky enough to play with an Enchanter support, your game plan is pretty clear and straightforward. You're a ticking time bomb since your late game scaling outperforms most other champions with ease, especially when you have a support like Lulu who can protect and empower you, both during lane and later on. Admittedly, against Twitch and Janna, the late game is not free by any means, since they are on a very similar game plan. But nonetheless, your objective in lane is to just farm it up and scale with your items. As you know, Kog'Maw unlocks his damage by making use of his W, namely the combination of W's on hit damage and increased range, which means his playstyle ultimately revolves around kiting. As a consequence, the biggest relative power spike for him is finishing Berserker's Greaves. An enemy who disrespects tier 2 boots Kog'Maw and doesn't play around his W will start losing trades very heavily. As you saw, Janna lost a big chunk of health just from Q and a couple of W-empowered auto attacks without being able to do much back to Kog'Maw. And with a health disadvantage like this, the enemy have to respect Kog'Maw's W even more. Berserker's Greaves Kog'Maw with W and Ghost is a fierce fighter. Because of that early all-in power with upgraded boots, laning with an all-in or tank support like Braum in this example here isn't all that bad either. With boots, W and lethal tempo, Kog'Maw can capitalize very efficiently whenever the tank support manages to create an opening for you with her crowd control. Letting Kog'Maw auto-attack for free is a terrible idea for the enemy, but this is exactly what will happen when your ally can lock them down. And during the lane phase, playing with an all-in support isn't that different from playing with an enchanter. You still prioritize farm, but instead of protecting you with heals and shields, the tank keeps you safe with her peeling abilities. You could actually argue that Kog'Maw's laning is slightly better with tanks due to the aforementioned all-in power he gets with boots. In the mid and late game, however, it is a different story. Here the tank can of course still create openings, allowing you to hit your target for free, and this feels quite good. However, they can do very little beyond that. You are a priority target, and going on the offensive leaves you open to retaliation. The big difference is that heals and shields are point-and-click effects that get applied instantly, whereas crowd control is less reliable. The following sequence will show you what I mean. And the less consistently you can rely on your allies to protect you, the more heavily should you invest in defensive stats. Yes, conditioning and overgrowth are doing a lot of work in the late game, but further investing in items like Terminus and Jaxure the Protean is advisable here. The inverse is also true, logically speaking. The more your team can do to keep you safe, the more you can justify investing in more offensive items even in the late game. However, just because you theoretically can doesn't mean it's optimal. In fact, when Kog'Maw has a certain amount of attack speed, his W will already do so much damage that buying more offense would simply be overkill. From my experience, just 3 attack speed items, let's say Ruined King plus Rageblade plus Hurricane, is all you need to out-DPS most enemies. Yes, the enchanters keep you safe, but if you then still layer items like Jaxure, Randuin's or what have you on top of this, you can effectively just slam your head into the keyboard, killing everyone with no chance of dying yourself. Kog'Maw is a very potent late-game hypercarry in the current meta, and the only way to hard fail on this champion is when you mess up your lane phase and lose the game before you can unlock your scaling. To prevent that from happening, you can consult my AD Carry lane phase guide, which should be clickable on your screen.